Ethan Miller's story didn't begin in a polished office tower with glass walls and a skyline view. It began in a cramped apartment where the paint peeled from the ceiling, the heater rattled louder than the keyboard of his old laptop, and the night stretched into dawn without a trace of sleep. He was 22 then, young enough to still believe in impossible dreams, but old enough to understand what it meant to sacrifice everything for them. While his friends were out living carefree lives, chasing nights of laughter and fleeting pleasures, Ethan sat hunched over the glow of his computer, sketching designs, drafting business plans, and scrawling equations across scraps of paper scattered across the floor. His eyes were tired, but his mind burned with ideas too wild to be ignored. He didn't come from privilege. His parents were hard-working people who knew the value of every dollar but had none to spare for investment in something as fragile as a startup dream. Ethan learned early that if he wanted anything in life, he had to claw his way toward it with his own two hands. The company that would one day bear his mark wasn't born from inherited wealth or a network of powerful names. It was built on coffee-stained notebooks, unpaid bills, and a determination that bordered on madness. Those first months were brutal. He worked odd jobs during the day to keep the lights on, bartending, delivering packages, even scrubbing kitchens in restaurants long after the customers had left. By night, he poured his earnings into servers, code, and every little piece of technology that might bring him closer to the company he envisioned. It wasn't glamorous. His meals often consisted of cheap instant noodles, and his mattress was little more than a thin cushion thrown on the floor. Yet Ethan wore his struggle like armor, believing every hardship was carving him into the kind of man who could not be broken. It was more than ambition. It was obsession. Every rejection from investors, every closed door, every smirk from those who doubted him only fueled his determination. He would walk into investor meetings with a suit borrowed from a friend, his shoes scuffed but polished as best as he could manage, and stand there with a voice that trembled, but words that cut sharp with conviction. He was told more times than he could count that he was too young, too inexperienced, too reckless. But Ethan never walked away defeated. Each dismissal was a challenge, each setback a whisper daring him to try again. Years blurred into each other, the grind relentless. He lost relationships along the way. Friends who couldn't understand his constant absence. Girlfriends who resented his endless late nights and his inability to prioritize anything over his dream. Loneliness became his constant companion, but Ethan accepted it as part of the price. He kept reminding himself that all of it would mean something one day, that the sacrifices would not be for nothing. Slowly, painfully, the tide began to shift. His ideas started attracting attention. First, it was a small investor willing to gamble a modest amount. Then another, with deeper pockets, drawn not just to the concept, but to Ethan himself, the fire in his eyes, the relentless way he spoke, about changing the world. With every dollar invested, he poured his soul back into the company, refusing to waste a single opportunity. The office upgraded from his apartment floor to a small rented space above a laundromat, the air perpetually heavy with the scent of detergent and steam. Yet to Ethan it felt like the beginnings of an empire. He hired his first employees, 2 young programmers who believed in him as fiercely as he believed in himself. They worked side by side, eating greasy takeout on the office floor, coding, until their fingers ached. Ethan wasn't just their boss, he was one of them, sitting cross-legged with his laptop, brainstorming through exhaustion, always pushing, always demanding more of himself than he did of anyone else. His company was still fragile, still hanging by a thread, but it was alive. And that was everything. With every milestone, Ethan's resolve only deepened. He watched as competitors with better funding tried to overshadow him, but he refused to fold. He made connections, charmed potential partners, and learned to navigate a business world that was as ruthless as it was glittering. His name began to circulate in hushed conversations, the kind reserved for the kind of underdog story people couldn't help but root for. What most didn't see was the toll it took. Ethan's body bore the scars of sleepless years, dark circles under his eyes, calloused fingers from endless typing, a back that ached like he was twice his age. But none of it mattered. Every time he looked at the small, flickering sign outside, their office, the one with the company's name stenciled in bold letters, he felt a pride no words could capture. He had built something from nothing, brick by brick, line by line, sacrifice by sacrifice. And though he couldn't know it then, that very empire he had bled to create would one day become the battlefield of betrayal, the very ground where loyalty would be tested, where faces he trusted would twist into something unrecognizable. For now, though, Ethan only saw possibility, only felt the burn of ambition in his chest, and only believed in one undeniable truth, that this company was his life, his legacy, his everything, and nothing in the world could ever take it away from him. Ethan Miller never imagined that the greatest danger to his dream wouldn't come from outside competitors, but from the very people he welcomed inside his circle. When the company began to grow beyond those first fragile years, he knew he couldn't carry the weight of it all on his own. He needed partners, people who could bring experience, connections, and stability to a vision that was rapidly expanding beyond his reach. At first, it felt like a blessing when those partners appeared. They came with polished smiles, well-tailored suits, and the kind of confidence that made boardrooms fall silent when they entered. They spoke Ethan's language, or at least pretended to. They praised his innovation, applauded his work ethic, and told him they believed in him. For a man who had spent years being doubted, their validation was intoxicating. The first of them was Daniel Price, a man in his early 40s with decades of experience in corporate finance. He had the kind of resume that could open doors Ethan hadn't even known existed. When Daniel shook his hand and promised to help build this thing into a giant, Ethan felt a surge of hope. Then there was Claire Donovan, sharp, elegant, and ruthless in her efficiency. She had run operations for 2 major firms before, and she spoke in the clipped, decisive tone of someone who never second-guessed herself. She promised Ethan that with her managing logistics, he could finally focus on the creative side of the business. Together, they looked like the perfect team. But beneath the surface, small cracks were already forming. Cracks Ethan was too blinded by ambition and trust to see. Daniel and Claire had not come into his life to simply help him grow his dream. Behind closed doors, when Ethan wasn't around, their conversations took on a different tone. They admired his drive but questioned his naivety. They saw how much control he willingly handed them, how eager he was to trust, how desperately he wanted to believe they were on his side. To them, Ethan wasn't just a partner. He was an obstacle. A visionary, yes, but also a young man who lacked the cutthroat instincts of seasoned players. And in their world, visionaries who couldn't protect themselves were meant to be devoured. The company was gaining traction, investors were circling, and profits were finally rolling in. The higher it rose, the more Ethan became a target. His partners, once his strongest allies, began planting seeds of doubt among board members and investors. They whispered that Ethan was too emotionally attached to make sound business decisions, too reckless with his ideas, too inexperienced to lead a company poised to dominate the market. They smiled in his presence, clinking glasses in toast to their shared success, while quietly sharpening the knives they intended to plunge into his back. It wasn't just ambition that drove them, it was greed. They saw the empire Ethan had built from nothing, the wealth it promised, and they wanted more than just a piece of it. They wanted control. They wanted ownership. And most dangerously of all, they believed Ethan was expendable. Late at night, in dimly lit restaurants and whispered phone calls, their plans began to take shape. Ethan's name, the very soul of the company, was the one thing standing between them and absolute power. They studied him the way predators study prey, noting his weaknesses, testing how far they could push before he pushed back. And every time, he failed to notice. Every time he overlooked a subtle betrayal in the name of trust, their confidence in their scheme grew stronger. To Ethan, these were his partners, his comrades in the war of business, people he thought he could lean on when the weight of the company grew too heavy. But to them, he was little more than a stepping stone, a man whose brilliance could be harvested and discarded once he had served his purpose. The betrayal was already in motion, threads being woven into a trap so carefully constructed that by the time Ethan realized what was happening, he would already be entangled in it. They smiled across boardroom tables, posed with him in photographs, and sent congratulatory emails about every milestone. But behind the scenes, their voices lowered into conspiratorial tones. Their eyes gleamed, with ambition darker than Ethan could ever have imagined. They were already plotting to erase him from the empire he had built, to strip him of the very identity that had consumed his life for years. And Ethan, blinded by the glow of trust and hope, never saw it coming. It was well past midnight when Ethan Miller first felt the uneasy prickle that something wasn't right. The office was quiet, the kind of silence that settles after everyone has gone home, leaving only the hum of servers and the occasional groan of pipes in the old building. Ethan was still at his desk, sleeves rolled up, eyes heavy with exhaustion but locked on a presentation he was preparing for a new round of investors. Numbers, charts, and projections swam before him, but his mind kept circling back to a nagging thought he couldn't quite shake. For weeks, small inconsistencies had been surfacing, contracts delayed without reason, meetings rescheduled behind his back, and a faint but unmistakable sense that conversation stopped the moment he entered the room. That night, while shutting down his computer, he noticed a light still glowing from the conference room down the hall. It wasn't unusual for employees to work late, but at this hour, only a handful of people had keys. Curiosity, mixed with unease, pulled him toward it. The closer he walked, the clearer he could hear voices, low, hurried, and urgent, the kind of tones people used when they didn't want to be overheard. He paused outside the frosted glass door, heart pounding, his hand instinctively tightening around the strap of the bag slung over his shoulder. He recognized the voices immediately. Daniel Price and Claire Donovan, his partners. Ethan leaned closer, careful not to make a sound. "He's too naive to notice," Daniel was saying, his voice carrying the smugness of someone who thought he already held the winning hand. "All he cares about is the vision, the dream. That's his weakness. He doesn't see the numbers the way we do. He doesn't see the leverage." Claire's voice followed, calm and razor sharp. "And that's exactly why he won't see this coming. We'll have the contracts finalized before he even realizes his signature isn't needed anymore. The board is already listening to us. Once the new investors are on our side, Ethan's influence won't matter." Ethan's stomach twisted. His grip on the bag loosened, and for a moment he thought he might drop it. He pressed his back against the wall, forcing himself to breathe quietly, every nerve in his body alive with shock. Daniel chuckled, the sound low and bitter. "He built the company, sure, but that doesn't mean he deserves to keep it. Visionaries are a dime a dozen. We're the ones who know how to turn this into real money. Once we cut him out, this empire will finally run like it's supposed to." The words cut deeper than any knife. Ethan felt heat rise to his face, a burning mix of anger and disbelief. These were the people he had trusted with everything, the ones he believed shared his blood, sweat, and sleepless nights. He thought of the moments he had leaned on them, confided in them, celebrated victories with them. And here they were, plotting to erase him from the very thing he had sacrificed his life for. Claire's voice was quieter now, but every word carried venom. We can't underestimate him. He's smarter than he looks, and if he gets even a whiff of what we're doing, he'll fight back. We need to make sure every move is airtight. Daniel replied with a dismissive laugh. Please, Ethan still thinks we're his friends. By the time he realizes the truth, the ground will already be gone beneath him. He'll have nothing. Ethan's pulse thundered in his ears. The air felt heavy, suffocating, as though the walls themselves were closing in. He wanted to burst through the door, confront them, scream in their faces for their betrayal. But another part of him, the part that had clawed his way from nothing to this very moment, held him back. Confrontation now would mean playing into their hands. If they were already moving against him, then exposing himself too soon would only give them more power. He forced himself to retreat, every step down the hallway echoing like a drumbeat in his skull. His mind was a storm, memories of late nights working side by side with Daniel, of Claire reassuring him when investors grew cold, of the moments he thought they were allies bound by the same vision. Now he saw those moments differently. Every kind word, every supportive smile, every gesture of loyalty, each had been a mask, carefully worn until the time was right to strike. By the time Ethan reached his desk again, his hands were trembling. He sank into his chair, staring at the glowing screen without seeing it. The presentation in front of him blurred, meaningless now compared to the weight of what he had just heard. Betrayal wasn't just looming on the horizon. It was already unfolding around him. The trap had been set, and he had nearly walked into it blind. For the first time in years, Ethan didn't feel like the visionary who could conquer the impossible. He felt like prey, hunted, surrounded by predators who had been circling all along, waiting for the right moment to sink their teeth into everything he had built. And yet, beneath the fear and shock, something else began to stir within him. A spark, a cold, quiet fire that whispered he would not be destroyed so easily. The people in that room thought they had already won. They thought Ethan was too blind, too trusting, too naive to fight back. They had no idea what he was capable of when pushed into a corner. The days after Ethan overheard that late-night conversation felt like walking through a maze of shadows, every turn revealing something darker than he expected. At first, he told himself maybe he had misunderstood. Maybe exhaustion had played tricks on his mind. But then the evidence began to pile up, subtle, almost invisible to anyone who wasn't looking for it, but glaringly obvious to Ethan now that suspicion had opened his eyes. Contracts that once required his review were suddenly handled before reaching his desk. Documents arrived with his name buried in the fine print, phrased in ways that stripped away more of his authority each time. Claire, once meticulous about transparency, now brushed him off with quick assurances. It's just standard legalese, nothing to worry about, before sliding papers across the table for him to sign. Daniel had grown bolder, speaking over him in meetings, redirecting questions that should have been his to answer, making decisions as though Ethan's approval was an afterthought. The worst was the forged documents. At first glance, they looked legitimate, contracts stamped, signed, and filed as though he had been involved every step of the way. But Ethan knew his own handwriting, his own signature, and though the imitations were close, they weren't perfect. He stared at them late, into the night, the pit in his stomach deepening with every stroke of ink that wasn't his. They were already rewriting his authority, cutting him out of deals and binding the company to decisions he had never agreed to. The noose was tightening, strand by strand. Investors who used to come directly to him now funneled their conversations through Daniel. Claire controlled access to schedules and budgets, often forgetting to loop Ethan in until decisions were already finalized. Even the board, once loyal to the founder who had built everything from nothing, seemed to be slipping from his grasp, seduced by Daniel's confidence and Claire's polished strategies. Where Ethan spoke with passion, they began to see recklessness. Where Ethan dreamed big, they saw instability. Daniel and Claire had done more than plot behind his back. They were reshaping the narrative, painting him as the visionary who had outlived his usefulness. Each day was a performance. Ethan forced himself to smile in meetings, to shake hands, to act as though nothing was wrong, even as fury churned beneath his skin. He became hyper-aware of every glance exchanged between his partners, every hushed phone call taken just outside his office, every piece of paper slid across the table with too much eagerness. They thought he was blind, too caught up in his ideas to notice the ground disappearing beneath him. What they didn't realize was that Ethan had already begun documenting everything, every suspicious change, every forged signature, every whisper of betrayal. The trap was closing, but he refused to let it snap shut without a fight. Still, he couldn't ignore the weight pressing against his chest, the growing dread that each day might be the day they struck the final blow. The company he had built with sweat and sleepless nights was slipping from his fingers, not through hostile competitors or market failures, but through the hands of those he had trusted most. It was like drowning slowly, the water rising inch by inch, and knowing that the people you thought would pull you to safety were the very ones holding your head beneath the surface. The boardroom had once been Ethan's sanctuary, a place where he could pour out his vision and watch eyes light up with the same fire that consumed him. In those early days, every pitch, every plan, every word he spoke carried the weight of someone who had built a dream brick by brick. But now, sitting at the head of the polished oak table, he felt the shift in the air like a cold wind crawling across his skin. The room no longer belonged to him. It wasn't obvious at first. It was subtle, almost imperceptible if you weren't looking for it. The way board members leaned ever so slightly toward Daniel when financial reports were discussed. How Claire's carefully prepared charts seemed to answer questions before Ethan even opened his mouth. The tone of conversations had changed too. Where once people sought Ethan's approval, now their eyes darted to his partners, searching for confirmation, for reassurance, as though his words no longer held weight. The betrayal didn't come in a single moment of open defiance. It came in dozens of small cuts. Someone would interrupt him mid-sentence with a question better suited to Daniel. Claire would phrase suggestions as though they were already agreed upon, leaving Ethan cornered to either nod along or risk looking like the one disrupting progress. Every glance, every shrug, every polite smile carried the unspoken message: you are losing control. Ethan tried to fight back at first. He raised his voice in meetings, defended his decisions, reminded everyone of the sacrifices he had made to build what they now sat around profiting from. But the more he pushed, the more he felt the board's trust slipping through his fingers. His passion, the very thing that had carried the company from a dingy apartment to skyscraper boardrooms, was now being reframed as recklessness. His insistence on innovation was labeled impracticality. His intensity was painted as volatility. And Daniel knew exactly how to twist the knife. With his calm, measured tone and practiced charm, he would wait until Ethan's frustration boiled over before stepping in with a soothing remark. What Ethan means, Daniel would say smoothly, is that he sees the bigger picture, but we need to stay grounded in practical terms. A few chuckles, a few nods, and suddenly Ethan looked less like a leader and more like a dreamer who had lost touch with reality. Claire played her role just as ruthlessly. She framed Ethan's absences, nights spent coding, strategizing, building, in ways that made him seem careless. She painted his late responses to endless emails as irresponsibility, glossing over the fact that he was the only one still bleeding for the company in the trenches while they polished their reputations in front of the board. What cut deepest wasn't the betrayal itself, but the realization of how seamlessly the others accepted it. These were men and women who had once toasted him, who had praised him as the heart of the company. Now they avoided his eyes, shifting in their seats when he spoke, waiting politely for him to finish before turning back to the people they clearly trusted more. The walls that once echoed with his voice now absorbed it, leaving him hollow and unheard. That boardroom, once a temple to his sacrifice, had become a courtroom, and he was the one on trial. Every word he spoke was weighed, every decision questioned, every idea dismissed as though he hadn't earned the right to dream anymore. He could feel the walls closing in, the ground slipping away. The empire he had poured his soul into being carved out from under him, one polite smile at a time. Ethan sat there, outwardly composed, inwardly burning. He had thought betrayal would come with slammed doors, with shouted arguments, with someone boldly declaring war. But no, this was quieter, deadlier. It was the slow erasure of his place in the very story he had written with his own blood. And, as he stared around that polished table, seeing the faces of people who had already chosen sides, Ethan realized his confidence had been shattered not by enemies outside, but by the treachery within. The day it happened, Ethan woke with the kind of nervous energy that always came before major meetings. He dressed carefully, pulling on his best suit, knotting his tie with precision, reminding himself that no matter the whispers, no matter the tension building in the air, this was still his company. He had built it. He had sacrificed for it. Surely, no one could take that from him without a fight. He walked into the glass-walled boardroom that morning with his head high, unaware that by the time he walked out everything would have changed. The atmosphere was wrong from the start. The usual chatter before meetings was absent, replaced by a heavy silence broken only by the shuffle of papers and the muted clink of coffee cups. Board members avoided his eyes. Even the ones who once laughed at his jokes, who leaned forward with admiration when he spoke, now sat stiff and distant, their expressions carefully blank. At the far end of the table, Daniel and Claire sat side by side, composed and unnervingly calm, as though they had already rehearsed every word that was about to be spoken. Ethan took his seat at the head of the table, but the weight of it felt different, colder, heavier, like a throne that no longer belonged to him. He began his presentation, laying out the company's progress, the innovations in the pipeline, the milestones ahead. His voice carried the same conviction it always had, but as he spoke, he noticed the vacant stares, the half-hearted nods, the way no one seemed to truly be listening. Then Daniel cleared his throat. "Ethan," he said smoothly, interrupting mid-sentence, "we all appreciate your passion. Truly, without you, none of this would exist. But passion isn't enough anymore." His words were measured, deliberate, carrying the tone of someone speaking not just for himself but for the entire room. "This company has outgrown its founder. We need stable, seasoned leadership to guide it into the future." The words landed like a blow to the chest. Ethan's pulse spiked, his breath catching as he scanned the faces around the table. Not one person moved to defend him. Not one met his eyes with sympathy. Claire slid a stack of papers across the table, her expression unreadable. "The board has already reviewed the proposal. A unanimous vote has been reached. Effective immediately, the company will transition to new management." She paused just long enough for the silence to suffocate him. "You'll of course be compensated generously for your contributions. Consider it A golden handshake. Ethan's hands tightened around the edge of the table until his knuckles turned white. His ears rang with the rush of blood, his mind reeling as the truth crystallized. They had orchestrated this perfectly. Every forged document, every whispered doubt, every subtle undermining, it had all led to this moment. His empire, his life's work, was being ripped from him not with violence or chaos, but with signatures and smiles. He wanted to fight, to scream, to remind them all that without him there would be no company, no product, no empire to steal. But as he looked around the table, he saw nothing but resolve in their eyes. They weren't listening. They had already decided. The papers lay in front of him like a death sentence. His name, the one he had once written proudly across every blueprint and contract, was now reduced to a formality, a line to be erased, replaced, forgotten. The people he had trusted, the ones he had brought into his vision, were now vultures circling the carcass of everything he had built. The meeting dragged on, but Ethan barely heard the words. They spoke of restructuring, of stability, of future, growth. To him it was all noise, the sound of his life being dismantled piece by piece. He sat there, outwardly composed, inwardly shattered, feeling the weight of betrayal heavier than any burden he had ever carried. And when the final vote was cast, the empire he had created was no longer his. It was gone, snatched from his hands, in the coldest, most calculated betrayal of all, not with open hostility, but with a ruthless efficiency that left no room for argument, no space for redemption, no chance to fight back. The nights that followed were long and suffocating. Ethan would lie awake in his apartment, staring at the ceiling as the city lights flickered through the blinds, his mind replaying that boardroom scene again and again. Every word, every dismissive glance, every polite smile that masked betrayal. They haunted him, each memory carving into his chest until sleep became impossible. He had given 25 years of his life to this company, and in the span of a single meeting it had been ripped from him as though he were nothing more than a placeholder in a story he had written. But as the hours dragged into dawn, the grief began to change. The raw pain of loss hardened into something sharper, colder. Rage. Not the kind that burned fast and loud, but the kind that smoldered quietly, steady and unrelenting, like coal glowing beneath ash. Ethan wasn't the type to beg, and he wasn't the type to forget. They thought they had erased him. They thought by signing papers and silencing his voice, they had buried him for good. They were wrong. Every sleepless night became a workshop of revenge. Ethan replayed every conversation he had ever had with Daniel and Claire, sifting through words for weaknesses he could exploit. He combed through old emails, contracts, and archives, searching for the smallest cracks in the armor of their betrayal. Where most men would have drowned in despair, Ethan found focus. Revenge gave him clarity. The loneliness of those nights no longer frightened him. He embraced it, using the silence as fuel for his thoughts. The same obsession that had once built his empire now turned toward a different goal, making sure that Daniel, Claire, and every board member who had raised a hand against him paid for what they had done. He didn't want sympathy. He didn't want his seat back. He wanted them ruined. And so the storm inside him grew, not loud or reckless, but quiet and calculated. Every beat of his heart was a drum announcing the war he was about to wage. They had taken his company, but they had underestimated the one thing they couldn't strip away: his ability to fight back from the shadows. Ethan knew that revenge wasn't about anger. It was about patience, precision, and timing. The very qualities Daniel and Claire had mocked him for lacking were the ones he would now weaponize. While they celebrated their victory, basking in the illusion of total control, Ethan quietly began his counterattack. Not with confrontation, not with open defiance, but with the meticulous gathering of every piece of evidence they had carelessly left behind. He started small. Late at night, when his apartment was cloaked in silence, he would sift through old backups stored on his personal drives, emails, draft contracts, meeting notes. Years of obsessive record-keeping, something they had always teased him about, now became his greatest weapon. Buried in those archives were conversations where Daniel had bent the truth, documents Claire had rushed through without proper approval, inconsistencies so subtle most people would have overlooked them. Ethan saw them all now with razor clarity. Then came the forged signatures. He gathered every questionable document he could find, comparing them against his real handwriting. Each loop, each curve, each stroke of ink told a story, and when he lined them side by side, the pattern was undeniable. Proof that someone had signed his name without him. Proof of fraud. Proof of betrayal written in black and white. He didn't stop there. Ethan reached out quietly to people he still trusted, those who had once worked closely with him before Daniel and Claire tightened their grip. Old employees, former investors, even interns who had been dismissed as unimportant. Many of them carried memories, emails, or even quiet grudges of their own. Piece by piece, Ethan collected their accounts, weaving them into a tapestry of deceit that stretched further than even he had imagined. Every discovery only fueled him more. It wasn't just about proving they had wronged him. It was about building a weapon they couldn't defend against. Daniel and Claire thought they had covered their tracks, but in their arrogance they had left trails. Small, invisible to those who weren't looking, but Ethan had nothing left but time and fury. He followed every breadcrumb, no matter how faint, until the picture became clear. They hadn't just betrayed him. They had broken laws, manipulated investors, and rigged the very foundation of the company. And all the while, Ethan never let them see it coming. When he crossed paths with Daniel or Claire in public, he offered them the same hollow smile they once gave him, a smile that masked the storm beneath. They believed he was defeated, licking his wounds in silence. What they didn't realize was that Ethan wasn't broken. He was building. Building a case, building leverage, building the trap that would one day snap shut with a force they couldn't escape. The evidence piled higher with each passing week. Hard drives full of documents, folders of emails, signed statements from people who had once been silenced. Ethan kept it all organized with the same obsessive precision he had once used to grow the company. Except this time, the goal wasn't growth. It was destruction. Their destruction. Daniel and Claire believed the war was over. To them, Ethan was nothing more than a ghost now, an inconvenient reminder of the past, stripped of power, stripped of influence. They walked through the gleaming halls of the company with the confidence of victors, shaking hands with investors, giving interviews, smiling for cameras. Their names were on the headlines, their voices the ones quoted in glossy magazines, their photos splashed across business journals. They looked unstoppable. But arrogance has a way of blinding even the sharpest predators. The more control they seized, the less careful they became. They spoke openly in places they once whispered, laughed too loudly about their success, signed off on decisions with a recklessness born of overconfidence. And all the while, Ethan was watching. He knew better than to strike too soon. Revenge wasn't a single blow. It was a carefully orchestrated unraveling. So he waited, feeding their arrogance by playing the role of the forgotten man. When reporters reached out, he declined to comment. When former colleagues asked how he was doing, he answered with a dismissive shrug. He let the world believe the story Daniel and Claire had written, that he had been a dreamer who lost his grip, a visionary who couldn't handle reality. He allowed the lie to grow unchecked, because the higher they climbed, the harder their fall would be, and they were climbing fast. Daniel flaunted his strategic brilliance, making bold moves that drew in even more investors. Claire polished the company's image, presenting herself as the iron hand that kept everything in line. Together, they painted the illusion of perfection, an empire stronger than ever, no longer weighed down by its founders' so-called recklessness. The board praised them, the press adored them, and their egos swelled to the point where they believed they were untouchable. But what they didn't see were the cracks beneath the surface, the very cracks Ethan had been quietly widening. Deals they had rushed into without proper due diligence. Numbers they had inflated to impress investors. Promises they had no means of keeping. Ethan had the proof of it all, and he knew the exact moment to use it. The trap was already set. Every forged document, every illegal maneuver, every manipulated report was a thread in the net Ethan had woven. And now, Daniel and Claire were walking straight into it, blissfully unaware that each step they took only bound them tighter. They believed they had erased Ethan Miller from the story. But what they didn't realize was that he was still the author, and the final chapter had yet to be written. The moment came quietly, almost too quietly for what it would become. There was no grand announcement, no dramatic confrontation in a crowded boardroom. Ethan had chosen his battlefield carefully, and it wasn't in meetings where Daniel and Claire held all the cards. It was in the court of truth, the one place where polished smiles and rehearsed charm couldn't erase evidence. It began with a single leak. An anonymous packet sent to a journalist who had been sniffing around the company for years, always suspicious of how quickly it had risen under Daniel and Claire's leadership. Inside the packet were documents, contracts with forged signatures, emails exposing backroom deals, spreadsheets that revealed financial manipulation, enough to raise questions, enough to ignite suspicion. The first article was published on a Monday morning, its headline sharp and damning. By noon it had spread like wildfire, investors calling in panic, employees whispering in hallways. Daniel and Claire scrambled, dismissing the report as baseless rumors, but the damage was already done. Reporters demanded answers. Regulators began circling. The board, once blindly loyal, started to waver under the weight of public scrutiny. Then came the second wave. Ethan had timed it perfectly. More leaks, this time to regulators, to rival companies, to key investors who had the power to cripple everything Daniel and Claire had built on lies. Each new revelation landed like a hammer, shattering their carefully crafted image piece by piece. Fraud, forgery, misrepresentation. The words began to stick, and no amount of denial could wash them away. What made it devastating wasn't just the evidence itself, but the precision with which it was released. Every time Daniel tried to refute one accusation, another piece of proof surfaced, cutting his defense to ribbons. Every time Claire attempted to reassure investors, a fresh wave of documents undercut her credibility. They were no longer the confident leaders on magazine covers. They were rats scrambling in a sinking ship, exposed to the world for what they really were. Inside the company, chaos reigned. Employees who had once idolized them now questioned their leadership. Investors pulled funding. Partners cut ties. The empire that had been stolen from Ethan was rotting from within, collapsing under the very lies that had been used to erase him. And through it all, Ethan stayed silent. He never appeared in the spotlight, never gave an interview, never revealed himself as the hand pulling the strings. To the world, it was an unraveling of greed and corruption. To Daniel and Claire, it was a nightmare with no visible enemy, an invisible storm tearing apart everything they had stolen. They knew deep down who was behind it, but they had no proof, no way to fight back without exposing themselves further. Ethan had waited for this moment, and now it was here. The truth had been unleashed, and it was spreading faster than they could contain. Their empire wasn't just trembling, it was crumbling, and soon it would come crashing down in ruins around them. The collapse wasn't loud, it was devastating in its quiet inevitability. By the time the board convened an emergency meeting, Daniel and Claire were already drowning in lawsuits, investigations, and accusations. Investors had pulled out, contracts were voided, and the press had turned from praise to ridicule. What was once hailed as the fastest-growing company in the sector was now branded a house of fraud. Ethan walked into that boardroom for the first time in months, not as the disgraced founder they thought they had erased, but as the man holding every card. His return was met with silence. Eyes that had once looked past him now followed him with unease. Daniel's face drained of color. Claire's composure cracked for the first time. They had built their empire on stolen ground, and Ethan was the earthquake tearing it apart. He didn't shout, he didn't gloat. He simply laid the final pieces of evidence on the polished table. Irrefutable proof of fraud, forgery, and betrayal. Documents signed in stolen ink. Bank transfers routed through shadow accounts. Deals that violated federal law. The kind of evidence that not only destroyed careers but ended in handcuffs. The board shifted in their seats, whispers turning into demands. By the end of the meeting, Daniel and Claire weren't leaders anymore. They were liabilities, stripped of their titles, their authority gone in an instant. Ethan had already made sure the fall wouldn't stop there. The regulators waiting outside, the doors, the lawsuits already filed in court. The investors he had quietly aligned with in secret meetings. It was all orchestrated so that when Daniel and Claire fell, they would fall completely. No safety nets, no chance of crawling back. Their names would forever be tied not to success, but to scandal. And as for the company, Ethan didn't reclaim it the way they expected. He didn't want what they had corrupted. Instead, he liquidated it, dismantling the very empire they had stolen. Piece by piece, he sold off its assets, redirected its resources, and ensured that every cent he could salvage went into ventures under his own name. Fresh, untarnished, unstoppable. Daniel and Claire were left with nothing but lawsuits and shattered reputations, their empire in ruins, their legacy destroyed. Ethan didn't just take back what was his. He took everything, leaving them with only the weight of their betrayal. When it was over, Ethan walked away not as the man they erased, but as the man who had written the final chapter. His revenge wasn't just about reclaiming power. It was about ensuring that Daniel and Claire would never forget the cost of betraying him. And they never would.